It was hot, and he was lying on the sand. A sharp rock was hurting his back. I'm crazy, he thought. Crazy or dead or something. Somehow he knew the area that he was in was circumscribed and finite, even though he could not see the top of it. He picked up some sand in his hand and let it run through his fingers. It tickled down onto his bare legs. Bare? Naked. I'm naked. And then it came back to him. Where'd he'd been, in a little one-man scouter outside the orbit of Pluto. He frenzied, fumbling as he strapped himself into the seat, the dot on the visi plate that grew larger. The awful knowledge that this was it. This was his first taste of battle. Within 3 seconds he'd be victorious or charred cinder, dead. 3 seconds, that's how long space battle lasted. Time enough to count to 3, slowly, and then you'd won or you were dead. Frantically, as unconsciously, his dry lips shaped the word won. He worked at the controls to keep that growing dot centered on the cross spider webs of the visi plate. His hands doing that, while his right foot hovered over the pedal that would fire the bolt. And then the outsider had swerved suddenly and was off the crosshairs. Carson punched the keys frantically to follow. For a tenth of a second, it was out of his visi plate entirely. And then the nose of the scouter swung after it. He saw it again, diving straight towards the ground. The ground? It was an optical illusion of some sort. It had to be. The planet, or whatever it was now covering his visi plate. And in his sudden anxiety to keep from crashing, he forgot even the outsider's ship, and made an emergency turn using his front braking rockets, but this blacked him out. And that was all. He was now sitting in the sand, stark naked but otherwise unhurt. No sign of his spaceship, or for that matter, no sign of space. He scrambled to his feet. Gravity seemed a little more than Earth normal. Out from under the nearest bush ran a little thing that was like a lizard, except that it had more than 4 legs. He looked up again, trying to decide what was overhead. It wasn't exactly a roof, but it was dome-shaped. It was although a blue hemisphere or something, about 250 yards in circumference, and everything was blue except one object in the far wall, a red object. This red object was roughly spherical and seemed to be about a yard in diameter, although he did not know what it was. Was this a dream, a nightmare? This heat, this sand, the vague feeling of horror he felt looking upon the red thing? Then he heard the voice. Inside his head he heard it, not with his ears.
Through spaces and dimensions wandering, and in this space and in this time, I found 2 people about to wage a war that would exterminate one and so weaken the other that it would regress and never fulfill its destiny, but to decay and return to mindless dust whence it came. And I say this must not happen. You and your opponent are here pitted against one another, naked and unarmed, under conditions equally unfair to you both, equally unpleasant to you both. There is no time limit, for here there is no time. The survivor is the champion of his race. That race survives.
Carson looked and saw the red sphere of horror where the outsider was rolling towards him. Carson looked around frantically and found a stone. He picked it up and crouched to receive an attack. Then it was stopped, abruptly. The near side of it flattened as though he had run up against an invisible wall. Carson took a half a dozen steps forward, and his left hand groped out before him, and then his hand touched the barrier. It felt smooth, yielding, like a sheet of rubber rather than like glass. It was completely invisible, even at close range. He then dropped the stone and put both hands against it, pushing. It seemed to yield, just a trifle. It felt like a sheet of rubber, backed up by steel. He jumped and reached as high as he could, and the barrier was still there. Then the outsider was back again, and began to fill his mind with images of hatred and lust to kill. This made Carson extremely nauseous as he fought to clear his mind of it and drive out the alien's thoughts. Can we not have peace between us? The entity who brought us here has told us what must happen if our races fight. Extinction of one and the weakening and restoration of the other. The battle between them, said the entity, depends upon what we do here. Why cannot we agree on external peace? Your race to its galaxy, we to ours. Carson's mind was then filled with images of hatred and lust to kill once again. Okay, it's war. To the death. Carson then thought, maybe he could use telepathic powers. Die, he thought. You are going to die. He tried variations on it in mental pictures, but the roller went ahead as if none of it bothered it. After giving up on this idea, he began to think where it was vulnerable. Just how would he go about killing it if he had got the chance? he went back to study it. Then the roller caught a lizard and began pulling off its legs. Carson shuddered and wanted to turn his eyes away, but he made himself continue to watch. Everything he could learn about his opponent might prove valuable. The roller then tossed the dead lizard away from it, and it landed at Carson's feet. It had come through the barrier. The barrier wasn't there anymore. Carson began to think, the barrier gone, he must settle this now, and kill the outsider. But it wasn't gone. He found that out the hard way. Riding head on to it nearly knocked himself out. Seeing something coming through the air, he got his body out of the way, but there was a sudden sharp pain in his left leg. Carson then returned the attack, throwing rocks at the roller. One making a direct hit made Carson grin, although he quit grinning as he bent over to examine his calf of his left leg. It was bleeding pretty freely, and he knew he was in for trouble. Carson then caught a live lizard and threw it at the barrier, trying to understand what could go through and what couldn't. Carson then understood that the barrier was a screen to living things. Dead or inorganic matter could cross it. Water. The thought of it made him realize he was getting awfully thirsty. He'd have to find water. His throat dry and parched. Probably the intense heat was the cause. It was hot, 130 Fahrenheit, I'd guess. A dry, still heat without the slightest movement of air. Finding no water meant a deadline, for him at any rate, unless he could find a way to cross that barrier, or to kill his enemy from this side of it. Thirst would kill him eventually. His leg hurt rather badly now, and he decided that came first. He began using leaves and grass to make a bandage of sorts to cover his wound and stop the bleeding. Next, he made himself a knife. Using rocks, he fashioned himself a crude but lethal weapon. Then, he spent the next hour or two gathering rocks of suitable size for throwing and making several neat piles of them near his side of the barrier. Carson, then distracting his mind, sees a lizard and says, "Hello there." The lizard responds with,
"Hello."
Carson, surprised, he attempts to approach it, but it quickly scurries away. Then, killing two birds with one stone, he attempted to dig for water and also to see if he could get under the barrier, although he was unable to accomplish either. Carson then went to see what the roller was doing. The roller was operating some sort of catapult, moving sizable rocks onto a cup-shaped outfit and launching it towards him. Carson, then retreating to the rear of his domain, began throwing rocks at the catapult, although his arm quickly began tired. Although, even as his rocks hit the framework, they bounced off harmlessly. Then, with one of the stones striking another, it created sparks. Sparks! Fire! Proved man had made fire by striking sparks. Using brush and bits of tinder, Carson was able to create a fire. It went up in flames so fast that it singed his eyebrows. Then, throwing firebombs, the catapult burst into flames. With his leg throbbing steadily now, he then found himself sitting in the sand, as he was suddenly too weak to stand up. Hell must be like this, he thought, the hell that the ancients had believed in. Trying to think of methods of fighting used back in the ancient days, a spear came to mind. Then sorting through some rocks, he found a spearhead. And with the spearhead, Carson used a piece of wood as a shaft and began using leaves and grass to tie the spearhead to the top of the spear. He tried to stand up to see what the roller was doing now, and found that he couldn't get to his feet. On the third try, he got as far as his knees, and then fell flat again. I've got to sleep, he thought. If a showdown come now, I'd be helpless. He could come up here and kill me if he knew. I've got to regain some strength. Slowly, painfully, he crawled back away from the barrier. 10 yards, 20 yards. He wakes by the sound of a rock missing his head by an inch. He'd fallen asleep too soon, he realized, while he was still in range of the roller's throwing ability. He started crawling again, this time forcing himself to keep going until he was as far as he could go, until the colorless oblique wall of the arena's outer shell was only a yard away. Then things slipped away again. When he woke, nothing about him was changed, but this time he knew that he had slept a longer time. Something was wrong, he knew as he returned slowly to full awareness. But there was pain, agonizing pain. It wasn't until he tried to move that he knew it was coming from his leg. With the thought of all humanity on his back, it gave him courage to start crawling, almost blindly in pain, towards the barrier again. Unable to crawl, he pulled himself along by only his arms and hands. Once reaching the barrier, almost giving up, Carson hears a voice.
Hello! Hurt, kill, gone!
Ignoring the voice,
Hurt,
as
kill,
Carson
gone.
believed it was the thought of his imagination,
Hurt, kill,
it kept
gone.
on. Obviously, it wanted Carson to follow it along the barrier. Carson groaned. There would be no peace unless he followed the blasting thing. He followed it and soon found the squealing lizard, the lizard whose legs the roller had pulled off so long ago. He took the flint knife from his belt and killed the tortured creature. The lizard he had just killed, it had crossed the barrier still alive. It hadn't been dead, it had just been unconscious. Carson then understood that the barrier was not a barrier then to living flesh, but to conscious flesh. And with that thought, Carson started crawling along the barrier to make his last desperate gamble. Taking with him a rock from a nearby pile, he climbed to the top of a dune, leaned against the barrier, and struck. Pain brought him back to consciousness. He laid still and waited until the roller was only a few feet away, and then attacked with his knife and spear. The bell was ringing. It was his communications plate signal. It was purely reflex action that enabled him to reach forward and throw the lever. Mandela to Carson. Come on in. The fight's over. We've won. Slowly, Carson set the controls for the return. Slowly, unbelievably, he unstrapped himself from the seat and went back to get a drink of cold water. He leaned there against the wall, trying to think. Had it happened? He pulled up his trouser leg and looked at the calf. There was a long white scar there, but perfectly healed. It hadn't been there before. It had happened.